Welcome, Dr. Pierre, to Socially Just, the podcast of Touro University, California Public Health Program. This is a continuation of our public health speaker series. This is the 11th year of our annual speaker series, and we're so delighted to have had you speak to our students to inform us about misinformation and disinformation and the impacts on both medical mistrust and public health. So welcome again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So we'd like to continue our conversation, and let's talk about something really timely. There has been a recent claim in the media of Tylenol and autism, or let's say acetaminophen, and
say that twice.
and the link to autism. And I think this is just a really good and timely example of how misinformation is linked to a really hot topic. Tell us a little bit about your perspective, or give us your perspective on this issue.
Well, let me start by saying this. I think that when we, particularly in the field of medicine or even science more broadly, I think one of the fundamental things about science, even the term research, what does that mean? It means to look again, right? To search again and again and again. And so when we talk about scientific facts, what we're talking about are things that are repeatedly observable. And the more we observe them, the more we say, well, okay, this must be reality. I think for the public, oftentimes what can be frustrating about scientists and medicine is that, every 5 or 10 years, we kind of shift a little bit, right? Like, should postmenopausal women take HRT? Well,
Right.
sometimes we said yes, sometimes we said no. Should everyone be on a statin? Now, I would argue that from a scientific perspective, that's really what I often call the superpower of science. That we don't have dogmatic, immutable facts. We have the preponderance of evidence that makes us believe something with a certain probability. But it's possible that if we do other research, that might change. So let me start by saying I think that we can do a better job of educating the public that that's actually a positive, because I think that oftentimes the reaction is, oh, they keep changing their mind. They don't know what they're talking about, and so I don't have to believe anything they say. I can just believe, what I want to believe. And that is where, someone asked about the grifters, and that's where the grifters kind of pounce, right? They come in and they say, see, the doctors don't know anything. Well, I know the real thing. The real thing is XYZ. So to answer your question about, current events and acetaminophen and autism, I mean, the interesting thing is, there's this big announcement by the administration, and it's not based on really any new information.
Right.
The issue of Tylenol or acetaminophen and autism has been looked at in a number of different studies going back for years. Now, it is true, as I said earlier tonight, that there are some studies where an association has been found between acetaminophen exposure in pregnancy and the later development of or the presence of developmental disorders, including autism, but not limited to autism. On the other hand, I think if you talk to people in medicine who are working with pregnant women or kids or that kind of thing, they'll often cite what many people would consider to be a definitive study that was published a couple of years ago, including nearly 3 million children, that found no such association. So that's really the tricky thing, right? This claim, it's not completely out of left field. It's not, I don't think I would call it a lie per se. I think it's an example of something where it sounds like there's a biased read of the literature in order to make this claim. And I think that's kind of what we often see. We see people make a claim, and then you look at everything that's out there, and you cherry pick a couple things that support what your argument is, and that's what you emphasize. So I think that's at least a little bit of what we're seeing. That said, I will say that I looked at the guess it was from the White House, their public-facing summary of why the decision was made, and I didn't actually find it that far, from left field. I thought some of what they put in there was reasonable. I think the part that I struggle with is based on the information that we have. I don't think it was reasonable to make this sudden, announcement basically saying like we don't think it's safe for pregnant women to take acetaminophen. Like I don't think hardly anyone in the medical profession thinks that the data would support a claim like that. So anyway, it's a very tricky subject. I've only just read up on it a little bit in the past week. There is some basis for suggesting there might be an association, but the better studies that have really looked at confounding factors and larger numbers of kids, exposed in utero, have really not found any convincing signal that this is an issue of concern. And as I said, it's risk benefit. It's not just whether or not this thing might, whether or not acetaminophen might pose a risk. It's what is the risk of not using an intervention like that?
Right.
That's really not something I think that was covered at all.
So Dr. Cummings and I, we understand research speak, right? But I think that, for some of our other listeners, you might have lost them, right? When we talk about association versus, an actual fact or claim and kind of the difference. And so, we understand that an association is just that. It's a statistical association, right?
Right.
But I think that often a layperson or the everyday person reading who may have gone to a website, they don't understand the science behind it. And I think that is where we have lost touch with the average person. If one year we're saying you can take acetaminophen, 1 year not. 1 year you're supposed to have a mammogram every year, 1 year not. I mean, so there's a lot of inconsistencies in the way we present medical research. What do you think we can do to kind of shore up the public's opinion, right? When it appears as though we can't make up our own minds. That's, for people who deal in facts and kind of move on, they're not enjoying the process of research that the three of us here, we enjoy the process, right? And we go back and we reread it and we say, oh, there's new evidence to support this or that. But I'm not sure that the public enjoys kind of this fluctuation back and forth.
Yeah, I think
in the same way.
I think science is a perfect science, and that's the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think, some of that is the psychology of belief. What people want often, particularly if we're talking about a threat or something scary or a societal crisis, we want definitive answers.
That's right.
And so people who do swoop in and say, here's the definitive answer, oftentimes there's something very appealing about that. So even if we look at like conspiracy theories, which has been a subject of some of my academic work through the years, we know that people are more vulnerable to conspiracy theories during times of crisis. So, again, during the COVID-19 pandemic, or when something pivotal happens in history, like, JFK is, shot. People feel panic, they feel scared, they're afraid, and they really like answers. Even if the answer is something like it's a conspiracy, which sounds really scary, but at least in theory, if you can identify the conspirators, then this could be prevented in the future. So I think that's the tricky thing, is that people really like answers. And some people, especially in the kind of media landscape that we have today, come in and they say, I have the answer. And they can get a lot of followers that way. I often think about President Obama. He was, one of the criticisms was that he was, quote unquote, dithering, meaning that he, when he had a question or he was trying to figure out what to do next, he would sit down and he would talk to experts and he would listen to arguments, and then he would make an informed decision, which, like, from someone in science, like, well, of course, that's what you should do. But no, people didn't like that. They want people to just, like, come in and say, oh, this is what we're going to do. So I think to answer your question, I really feel like from an educational standpoint, we could do a better job of teaching what I call the philosophy of science. Why is science a good way to get a better sense of what's true or what's real or not? You know, when we take science in grade school, I feel like it's more like I'm going to do an experiment with chemicals, right? That's the doing of science. I think we need to teach the philosophy of science. We have to understand why when we change our minds, that's not that scientists don't know what they're talking about. That's that we are changing our beliefs based on what the evidence is. And so I think a lot of the difficulty we see now are people that have this very high degree of confidence in what they believe, even though it's not really based on evidence. And that to me is a fundamental thing that we're struggling with right now.
Absolutely.
Right, yeah, and I think one of the things that resonated with both of us in the conversation earlier was the understanding how important that political divide is in terms of driving those beliefs. It's astounding when you look at sort of the data as you presented it to see where it was probably around 2014, 2015-ish, where things changed. And thinking about President Obama, one of the things he was concerned about in terms of sort of this sort of divided these divided ways of thinking and philosophy is it had a lot to do with how we use social media and the types of, for example, the 6 o'clock news used to be, one or two channels, not, having an a la carte choice of watching what you already believe, the networks that you already kind of trust. But I'm still, perplexed a little bit that, health and vaccines in particular have become such a political issue as opposed to being just medicine. How can you, what is that?
Well, it's a great question, and I think one of the things I mentioned during my talk was the concept of follow the money, right? I mean, the so-called anti-vaccine movement has been around for decades. And I think for a long time, and we saw that in some of the poll data that I presented, it didn't really catch on. Actually, I mentioned that I live here in Marin County. I mean, the old stereotype of a so-called anti-vaxxer was a liberal soccer mom living in Marin, and now we've seen that kind of flip-flop now where the traditional anti-vaxxer is more conservative. There was an article in the New York Times, I think it was earlier in the year, about how the idea of sort of crunchy granola has actually become now embraced on conservatives. You were hearing about like raw milk and all this kind of stuff. So it's so fascinating to see how some of these belief systems get absorbed within political parties. And I think, if you try to understand why did that happen, a lot of it had to do with, again, the pandemic, what happened during the pandemic, and that then aligning with this longer standing movement of anti-vaccine belief. And, when I hear people push back about vaccines, particularly here in this country, a lot of it has to do with a kind of fundamental American value of autonomy, right? So I think what kind of got us into trouble wasn't so much that people didn't think vaccines work per se. It was this idea that the government's going to mandate this. They're going to make me wear a mask in public. And so, and when we see that in the data with the parents and getting their kids vaccinated, it's not necessarily that they think, vaccines are bad. It's, I don't want anyone telling me what I can do with my parents, which, I'm a parent. I'm somewhat sympathetic to that view. So there's kind of a confluence of different things that have happened coincident with the pandemic where the anti-vaccine movement, really gained a lot of steam. Not to mention, of course, that, I mean, it just boggles my mind, but that RFK Jr. is now the head of DHHS. Right? That's just incredible.
So you mentioned something about follow the money. And I'm curious about that. You know, where is the money in anti-vaccine, right? And so I would have thought that our pharmaceutical companies, you know, considering the amount of influence they have, both politically, you know, and economically, in the United States in particular, that they would come out in full force, right, to combat kind of the anti-vax campaigns, that they would have come out to combat it through social media. Um, but I haven't seen that. And to me, that is very curious, where on almost any other level, the pharmaceutical company has a stronghold in the United States. So why not? Why not here?
That's fascinating. I mean, my short response is I'm not really sure. You know, I think the tricky part is if you look at the anti-vaccine movement, you know, the most evil force is pharma, right? And so, you know, again, if you quote a study saying vaccines are safe or they don't cause autism, you know, then it's like, oh, well, that researcher must be in bed with big pharma. You know, oh, what's their funding source? Have they ever gotten grant money? You know, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know why the pharmaceutical companies have not been more vocal, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was not that it's kind of, you know, there's this idea of the backfire effect that despite your best efforts, it's just going to ramp up the, you know, anti-pharma sentiment. And I think that's where healthcare workers come in, you know, where they are more neutral parties who can then speak up on behalf of what science shows without having that sort of vested interest. But again, even when, you know, some of the more vocal people who do speak out in favor of vaccines, again, the criticism is, oh, well, you know, you've gotten grant money from, you know, certain pharma company, and therefore I'm not going to believe a word that you say. And
Right.
again, the funny thing is that when you say, like, who's funding the anti-vaccine movement, these are people profiting from the idea that vaccines are harmful, right?
Right.
Even Andrew Wakefield originally, when he published the study that was retracted and it was found to be fraudulent, you know, he made up the data. Well, little known fact, he was actually trying to patent his own vaccine at the time.
Wow.
You know, so that's like an example of like follow the money, you know. And the most egregious example is not in healthcare, but it's, you know, like climate change. Like, why are people so opposed to the idea that there's such thing as man-made climate change? Oh, because it's the fossil fuel industry that's funding that, and the conservative politicians who are pushing for the idea that climate change is a hoax have tons and tons of money donated by, you know, the coal industry, the fossil fuel industry. So that's the follow the money piece.
Yeah, well, that is though an interesting perspective that I hadn't thought about. And I know we're running out of time, and I do have one more
Okay.
question. And you didn't get a chance to really talk about this in your presentation, but in the book you talked about, you know, these fixed false beliefs. There's a term that you use, and those seem like, you know, the extremists, you know, like the people who think, you know, regardless of all the evidence that's available, that the earth is flat, and they're going to hold on to these beliefs no matter what. And so I'm wondering, you know, I don't know, you know, in terms of numbers, are these people that have these types of fixed beliefs, should this be a community that we should be focused on? Are they just outliers? Is this sort of like the Mandela effect?
Mhm.
Should we be thinking about that group of people?
Well,
As
I mean,
public health professionals, I should say.
yeah. I mean, I will say that I think one of the points I try to make throughout the book is that the vulnerability to false belief is actually universal. None of us is immune to that. And the idea that we are is kind of part of the problem, right? Because then it's kind of a stereotypic example of what goes on today when we're, you know, disagree with someone is we assume that they're the one who's misinformed, right? That their confidence is the one that's unwarranted. I have the facts, and therefore I'm going to, you know, I'm going to be right, and I'm not going to back down. And one thing I talk about in the book is, growing up, I remember being in school and being in sort of like debate class. And in debate class, the idea was you present your argument forcefully and you never back down. Like if you back down and you go, hey, you know what? Your argument's better than mine, you're going to get an F, right? So I think we need to kind of get away from that mentality of like, it's about arguing and who's right. No, it's about really being, what I call cognitively flexible, being able to change our beliefs in light of evidence, and having intellectual humility. In the book, as you know, I talk about this idea somewhat irreverently of the holy trinity of truth detection, right? Which is intellectual humility, acknowledging that we could be wrong, cognitive flexibility, meaning we're willing to change our minds based on evidence or other people's viewpoints, and then analytical thinking, which always sounds like some kind of like super smart logical thing, but all it really means is pausing when we encounter information and saying, even though I want to believe this, maybe it's not right, and maybe I should really look more closely to decide if it's credible or not.
Well, thank you for that final thought, Dr. Pierre. We'd like to invite everyone to read your book, False: How Mistrust, Disinformation, and Motivated Reasoning Makes Us Believe Things That Aren't True. We think it's a timely read that we can all benefit from. So thank you again, Dr. Pierre.
Thank you so much. I often say it's unfortunate that it is such a timely read. Part of me wishes it wasn't, but there you go.
You have the foresight, and we appreciate you. Thank you again for joining us today and being on our podcast, Socially Just.
All right. Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Good night.
Okay.
Terrence?